I'm excited to be here with y'all, by the way.
Podium Audio presents.
Hi, well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you everybody for joining in today. I am Agatha Andrews. I am host of the She Wore Black podcast, and I am very excited to be here with this wonderful panel of authors that the TBRCon has put together. And while I do know Desiree and Hailey, I don't know everybody else, but let's go ahead and start introducing each other or introducing ourselves so that everybody watching knows who we are. Let's go ahead and start with Desiree and work our way down to Rin.
So I am Desiree M. Nicoli. I write adult romance and blend that with horror. So you could say that I like to make the genres kiss. I often include vicious ladies in my stories, settings that are very saturated in nature. So think like eerie bogs, foggy coastlines, spooky, creepy forests. And also I like to write monsters as the protagonists or the love interest. I currently have a Monstrous Merfolk series out now, a couple of bite-sized novellas, and then my next release, Untethering Dark, is coming out in a week, and it is Harlequin's first monster romance.
Very excited for that. Yay, Desiree. Let's go ahead and go with Shimaira.
Hello, I'm LB Shimaira. I write dark fiction, often inspired by my own dreams and nightmares. My first fully published novel was published by a small press, and a few years ago I actually published it myself again after the press ceased to be. In this case, it's about my own kind of vampires, and there goes my earbud. One of my common themes, tropes to include is basically trauma. Also because of myself. So
yeah. Thank you very much for that. How about you, Lynn? Can you hear me, Lynn? Can you hear me? I don't think Lynn can hear me. Let me see if I can get into this in the chat.
I think she froze again.
Yeah. In the meantime, Hailey, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hailey Piper. I'm the author of Queen of Teeth, No Gods for Drowning, The Worm and His Kings, and A Game in Yellow coming this August from Saga. I write books that tend to have they have sexuality, romance, erotic themes, sometimes with monsters, sometimes otherwise. And my big thing is make horror gay as fuck. Oh, shoot. Are we allowed to curse? Shoot, I forgot.
I know that might be because everyone's allowed to do that on my show, so I apologize.
Right. Agatha, you're a bad influence.
Is it me? Is it my fault?
Oh, yeah, she disconnected.
Yeah, she'll pop back in. How about you, Rin?
Okay, my name is Rin Chupeco, and I started actually as a young adult author, but also still writing a weird mishmash of horror, romance, and fantasy. And I have transitioned over the last year or so into writing adult horror romance as well. And my first adult book is Silver Under Nightfall, followed by its sequel, Court of Wanderers, and it's basically vampire hunter thruples, monster, everything monstery that I could throw in, I did, and that's basically it. I am still straddling between young adult and adult horror, so it's a fun place to be in right now.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. And just for anybody who's watching, I can see our comments are starting to fill up, and I won't be responding in the comments, but I will, feel free to put some questions there. I may pose them either in or like in as we're talking, or I may pose them at the end. But if you do have questions, I will be checking your comments. I just won't be responding to them in the comments. So a little bit of background on, this one is called Romance, Sex, and Sensuality in Horror. And a little bit of background on my show to kind of let you know where I'm going with this is, I know Desiree from all my years in romance, and there is a long, big history of romance having a space for horror and genre blending. And I was always that gothic romance lady. And so whenever I started really paying more attention to horror podcasts and the horror community, the conversations were happening, but it was really interesting because I think because men were such a major part of the horror community, as much as women are like a pinnacle part of the history of horror and still have a very large presence, like a lot of the shows or a lot of the attention they get during award season or whatever, that it's still very male centric. And so sometimes I wondered if that controlled the conversation a little bit. So I'm just kind of curious about what you all think and feel, given this long history of this genre blending, about where discourse, as it's always called, because it's always happening. What do you think, and what's your take on discourse? Let's start this time on the bottom. Let's start with Ren.
I think we just really need to normalize romance as something that, since it happens in real life, it's also something that should be normal when reading about when it comes to books. Because we do live in a society where I think romance is not treated in the same with the same gravity and the same seriousness as other genres like fantasy or sci-fi. And I think that's I've always felt that this is something. I mean, it's a shame.
Yeah.
You find so many good horror romance books, and so many people feel like they shouldn't be treated in the same vein just because there's the four-letter word.
Yeah.
Four-letter word in as part of that genre. And yeah, I think we do need to start show, like, the more people write about it, the more people read, the more people talk about it. I think it's a really good way to normalize it in the end. But
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because, like I said, romance has always had that. Like you go back and you look at old school Gothic romances, and you go back and look at Laurel K. Hamilton. I mean, just if there's like through the decades, it's always been there. But when you think about it from a horror space, that conversation is not the same as it is from the romance space. So I like your comment about like normalizing it in all spaces. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Hailey, you and I have talked about this on the side several times. So let's get your take.
Yeah, well, so I think I think Rin is exactly right, because the thing is, romance and horror are very closely related. I think they're the carnal genres. They have the most relationship between each other than with other genres. So you would think that there'd be some kind of like, mutual understanding there. And I think for a lot of us there is, but not for everybody.
Right.
And what ends up happening is, when you are getting into that, merged tissue between the two, you have horror people, because romance being so maligned, you have horror people kind of throwing romance in the bus, like, oh, why'd there have to be a love story? Why'd there have to be sex? Why'd there have to be this and that? And not understanding you're doing the same thing to romance that other people do to horror.
Yes, that is such an important point, and something that I always found interesting as the horror spaces started talking about it, which I have some questions about that too. But Lynn, I'd love to get your take too.
Well, I echo what Hailey has said. There is such a thin line between love / sensuality and terror or horror. They're both the most potent of primal emotions. And I think when you're experiencing those, there is no room for anything else. And I think also what is really important in these days is agency, the agency that women have, and in some cases need to have, in expressing ourselves through horror and through romance. Romance is often considered to be a very soft subject in a way, I think, culturally. And I think that that's part of the problem, that we have not had agency and power in dealing with this subject. So yes, I think, as Hailey said, these two things, these love and terror, are very, very closely linked.
It's a classic case of just because women and queer folk write it, it must be trivial. It's not, but we're not taken seriously. So what we write isn't always taken seriously.
Yeah, and speaking to that and to what you were saying too, Hailey, I think Chuck Tingle was also, because when Chuck Tingle broke out on the horror scene, a lot of us in romance were very scared about what you all would think, because we're so protective of Chuck Tingle in the romance world. And I've been very pleased to see just the open arms that he's received in horror. But he did say something similar to what Hailey was saying when he first kind of came onto the horror scene, because he was asked about his erotica a lot. And it is talking about those two primal, very closely related urges. They're very visceral things, fear and desire. So I think that's interesting that this is what happens. Like, Hailey, I know that you know romance as well as you know horror. So this is what happens when you have people who experience both conversations and look at genre with equal respect. You can understand that those two things go together. Yeah. Anyway, I just had to throw that in there because I'd forget otherwise. I'm sorry, Shimaira, go ahead.
Well, gotta be funny, difference here, because basically I used to be very much not into romance, at all. I was avoiding it a lot, also in what I would read. And it was only when I actually got into finding queer romance, or when it was come to combining horror and romance, or paranormal and romance, that I found, hey, I can enjoy this. But I do have to say that I'm also on the aromantic spectrum. So in hindsight, when I'm looking at everything, I'm like, yeah, that's probably plays a big role there for me.
Well, it's interesting because there is different work. So when you're looking at a genre blending where there's an intention of an HEA, a lot of times people will call that horror romance or horror-mance. But, reader expectations can differ, hence discourse. If there's a reader coming to it with the romance with the big R expectation combined with horror, so maybe they're looking for Isabel Caña's, Vampires of El Norte. They want that HEA, but the Hacienda didn't have the HEA, but it was very sexy. And so there's different work and different intention, just like there's different work that erotica is doing versus romance. So I'd love to talk about that. I'd love to talk about how you approach genre blending. What are your priorities? What does your reader look for when they pick up a Rin or a Hailey or a Lynn, or what any of your books? So let's talk about that and what your interests are. Let's go back in reverse. Desiree, I know what your readers like, but let's talk about it.
Okay, so when I'm writing a blend of horror and romance, the horror is happening primarily in the setting, in the plot, and in the stakes. So essentially, I want the leading couple to just have these terrifying things happening to them, around them, and it's kind of a catalyst for their relationship. Going back to the point that horror and romance go hand in hand, well, both elicit very similar physiological responses. So when you're afraid or when you're aroused, there's moaning, there's groaning, shivering, or there's so much parallel happening there. So if you're watching a horror movie with a loved one, there's a jump scare and you sit a little closer, or you grab their hand I use horror as a means to bring the couple closer together, essentially.
Yeah. And you do it very well. Let's go back around this way. Shimaira, did you have any a response to this?
Well, the romance in my book, and also the sensuality, actually, it came a little bit out of a left field, because when I started the book, or maybe I should go back. I used to write basically just more the pure horror, and then I was like, no. After the 50 Shades thing happened, I was like, I should be able to do that. I could do that. I tried it. I could not do that, because just pure erotic or romance focusing it's just not me. So instead, I started to write like this, more like a vampire Dracula kind of setting, castle and everything. And then the romance kind of slipped in there, but because there's also a lot of trauma going on, like the characters for me have their own life. So you can't actually force stuff on characters, especially if there are dark stuff going on. Like, you're not going to just get feelings, fall in love when there's someone basically drinking your blood. There needs to be some progression there, and just dealing with all the darker emotions. And that's also just the gothic part, of course, with the like the moral of it all. Like, what am I feeling? Is this okay? What the entire mix of everything? Like, how do you?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I like that you use the word gothic, which is my favorite. But, gothic, I mean, I love gothic romance. That's my very favorite. But I also do love and appreciate, because there's somebody here in the questions asking about like what we think too, whenever it doesn't end in an HEA. And so that's why I'm curious. Like, I want to get an idea of like your approaches, because sometimes, like for me and Desiree, we're going to want a happy ending, but that doesn't necessarily mean I won't like Tim McGregor's book that it's romantic and it's beautiful, but it doesn't have the HEA, but I still love and appreciate it. So I'm very curious about y'all's take on it. Go ahead, Rin.
Oh, well, I live in the Philippines, born and raised. So growing up, monsters has always been like part of our vocabulary. And it came to the point also where, if you're a queer person living in a society that doesn't necessarily want that, especially here, which is, we're the only country right now, I think, that does not even have divorce law. So you can imagine how conservative things are here. The main reason I feel that why I like monsters, why I like writing about monsters, is because we feel othered in the same way that monsters are othered. So basically, in Silver Under Nightfall, it's basically about a vampire hunter that falls in with the vampire couple that he's supposed to be hunting. And I wanted the main point there, and a really integral part of the romance that I wrote there, I feel, is that the vampire hunter in question feels so alienated among his own people that he finds more similarities in common with his prey than what the societal standards of what his people are going through. And I feel that a lot of queer people actually feel that same way, that sense of being othered. And I wanted to integrate that part into what a romance would feel like, not just because, like, sex romance, but also tapping into that sweet spot of feeling like you belong with a group, with somebody.
Absolutely. It's definitely a place where, marginalized people find a home. Yeah, absolutely. Hailey, I know you have a lot to say on this.
I mean, my situation was complicated because I also came to it first from horror, and the thing is, I go by instinct, so like I can't, like as Shimaira was saying, you can't make characters do something. So I've had books where I went in not intending it to have like a love story or something, but then it did. And ones where I went in intending it to be a horror romance, and that's not how it turned out. And I think it's easier to kind of like dip in and out of those that thematic material and those kinds of relationships without worrying as much, but which does feel unfair to romance readers who are expecting the HEA.
Yeah.
But like with Queen of Teeth, for example, like what is a monster is kind of a question of the book. Like the main characters are both queer, but one of them is physically transforming into a creature, starting with teeth growing out of her between her legs, and the other is more in a way a monster because she's working for the company that's hunting that first woman down.
Mm.
And then in the same as what Rin is saying, finds she has more in common with the woman she's hunting than the people sending her to do that. But
Those
yeah,
are great stakes. Those are great stakes.
Yeah, it's just, but so I'm not sure each time what I'm going to be getting into, but I do try to find characters who are going to be interested. I'm going to be interested in the relationships, however it turns out. I'm going to be interested in their sex lives, however it turns out. That doesn't make it easy for readers, though, because they could pick up one book. It's like, oh, I really want, HEA. And it's like, oh, this was a straight horror. There was no romance. And then they could pick up one. It's like, I just want a straight horror. It's like, okay, here's a bunch of sex scenes from start to finish.
Like portmanteaus are great if you want something pithy. If you want something pithy to kind of point someone in the direction of, but it can complicate a reader expectation.
Right.
And I have found with a lot of the authors I've interviewed, they will come up against that issue in their reviews. And so someone may pick up an erotic horror expecting an HEA, but erotic horror is different work than a horror romance. With that big R, and so when you say horror romance, and this group has one set of expectations and this one has a different set of expectations, it can be difficult for the author. So, we just like portmanteaus are cute and pithy, but they're not always helpful when it comes to reaching the right person.
But we also have to, I think, to express ourselves and our art and what matters to us. And then the readers for each project will find what
the right
they need.
thing.
Yeah.
Lynn, what's your take on all of this?
Well, I started out writing eco-fiction, and I still do. And I have to say, I came quite late to writing. I was probably 70 when I started to write seriously and be published. So I have a sort of a long history of life experience that has informed the kind of writing I do. And I got interested in horror after a terrifying experience that my daughter and I had out in the wild bush of rural Ontario. And that led me into being very interested in writing in horror. And then I saw through my own experience that there was more than just horror. It was a lens through which to see what is horrific in our world. My first novella, my current novella, which is called Origins of Desire in Orkin Fins, deals with horror, but in a very subtle way. I come to it from my background. My father was Romani, and the Romanis are othered in society and with extraordinary stereotypes attached to us. So I wanted to write about a young woman who did feel othered, who did feel on the outside of society. And growing up in a small town, she was even more conscious of her difference. When I wrote this novel, I was really interested in seeing the kind of sensual relationship that you can have with nature, which doesn't bite back the way humans do. So she gets very involved with an orchid fin, where she spends quite a bit of time and has a very sensual relationship with the vegetation in that fin, and sees during one visit a man rising from an islet in the fin, a man surrounded by vegetation. Is he human or is he not human? And that seeded the whole idea for me that we can bring beauty and horror, what is human, what is not human, what is other, what is incorporated into society, into a story. So that's what I did. I think that I didn't think in terms of genre when I was writing this, because for me, approaching things as a visual artist, I never thought about genre. I just thought about what was necessary for the story.
Right.
What feelings did the story evoke in me? What story did I want to tell? So genre didn't really come into the picture for me, although subsequently I have discovered that, in fact, genre is very important to a lot of readers when they're looking for something to read.
I am going to go ahead and go into the comments because somebody is asking a question, and then a couple of other people are like, yes, I have that same question. When I mentioned Vampires of El Norte, someone says, but Alini says, but it was an incredibly sexy book and yet as tame as they come with spice. And someone had a question about that. And I think it's important to kind of address, especially since I'm coming with romance from the big R, is that spice is not the point. Spice is a device to tell a story.
Was for the comment above that one, wasn't it?
What?
The question was for the one above that. That was the question.
Well, we kind of went the silent pages question. We've just finished addressing. Well, sort of. We'll come back to that. But no, I'm talking about I'm specifically pulling out the thing that says Vampires of El Norte was also an incredibly sexy book and has came as they come spice-wise, and then somebody underneath it says question. Silent pages. And so that's what I'm talking about, because it's important if we're going to discuss romance or sensuality or sex and horror at all, and we're talking about something where the intent, I mean, Isabel Cañas is as versed in romance as she is in horror and brings both to the table with intention. And so she's been reading for decades in both genres, and you will see that in her work. And that's why she's so effective at it. I mean, it's a legitimate question, because I think one of the things that has been interesting to see, a lot of romance readers that are new are coming to it just looking for spice, but that isn't actually the point of romance. Romance is a love story arc that ends with a happily ever after. And so spice can be there, but when you use spice in romance, the objective should be to tell the story of a building relationship. And so, like, for example, Desiree and I have been talking about reading the new Ruby Dixon, Bull Moon Rising. And one of the things about it is it's pretty spicy. I mean, but the spice doesn't even happen. Like, you don't even meet the dude until, like, I don't know, an hour into the audiobook, you know? But it's very sexy. And one of the things about it is every moment, even just an internal dialogue of desire, is still about building the relationship arc. And that's the point of romance with the big R. And, you know, when you incorporate these things. And so, you know, romance without that HEA or without that intention is, and just having it be spice is not as fulfilling. A lot of times people will just skip through that because they want a story. And so it's not right or wrong. It's just that, you know, to answer kind of the idea of spice or a question about it, that's what I would say, is that it's a device. I know, Desiree, you're coming out with Harlequin's very first monster romance, so you may have things to say about it.
So I would say that a sex scene is only as good as the emotional connection. If you're not building intimacy and leading up to a sex scene, it's going to ring very hollow. It's going to feel and read mechanical. So regardless of whether you have a sex scene or not, as long as you have the emotions and you do the work with the characters, building them up individually and then building them up together, that's what makes it, in my opinion.
And there's a long history of horror in romance. Like, so like I said, let's go back to start, like, let's look at the idea of old Gothic romances. You look at Mary Stuart's and Victoria Holt's. I mean, you can go back even further than that by like a century, but I'm sticking at least to this area. You know, because they understood, as you said earlier, the stakes and how that can, make a compelling story. And so you have like old school Gothic romances. Like I said, then we jump ahead to folks like Laurel K. Hamilton. And this isn't even including Anne Rice, who used sex and sensuality in a different way, which we can also talk about, because that's a different objective than what some of the Gothic romances were doing. But there is definitely horror that has always been in the romance genre. And so I'm curious, all of you wonderful writers are here today. What is your history? What were your early influences? Because these genres have blended for so long, what were you inspired by or reading before you started writing any of this? Let's start with Lynn and then work our way back.
Well, because I spent most of my life as a visual artist, I was very influenced as a child by visual arts. So I'm thinking of the erotic Japanese woodcuts. Particularly one that comes to mind is a woman who is engulfed in the arms of an octopus. And it's quite well known and quite gorgeous, terrifying, and lush. I also grew up with Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations from the 1800s, which also was had a very sinister, erotic element to them. And then, of course, there was Arthur Rackham, who illustrated fairy stories. And his illustrations of fairy stories that I read to my daughters were particularly potent, and they gave a completely different complexion to those stories. So I was raised also on classical literature and fairy and folk tales, a lot of Russian fairy stories. But I guess the classical work that I was very influenced by, one was Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, which features a young woman who is drawn to a crowd of goblin men at the edge of a river in the darkness. And although there is no kind of sexual relationship between them, it's very much implied. They're offering her fruits, beautiful fruits, and the way it's written is incredibly erotic. And these creatures, these sort of slithering, crawling creatures with whiskers and tails and feathers, entice this young woman to consume their fruits, and she becomes very you can't live without them. So that was one interesting influence. Another one was more recent, Marion Engel's Bear, Canadian writer. And in Bear, a young librarian is cataloging the library of a person out in the bush on an estate, meets a bear and has an extraordinary sensual relationship with this bear. So that was also a more recent influence. And of course, there's one of the Brontes, Wuthering Heights, with Heathcliff as the dark, threatening changeling. I'm very interested in changelings. The folk and fairy stories, well, there was Beauty and the Beast, but not the sanitized version that we see today, the really hardcore, terrifying version, which captivated me as a child. And then there's a Romany story, a folk tale about a young girl called Rubina who meets a bear at a river, and Rubina ends up bearing the child of this bear. So there is this, very interesting semi-bestial, semi-horror, but fully erotic component to a lot of the work that has influenced me. I haven't read a lot of romances, really. It's more that I've been steeped in this, the classical literature of my childhood.
I love all of these answers because fairy tale is one of the richest places to mine for these things. And romance has an entire Beauty and the Beast like subgenre. So a lot of inspiration has come from fairy tale because and I love that you referenced Goblin Market. I mean, there's so many, and art. I mean, Arthur Rackham, talk about fairy tale and capturing the sensuality there. Beautiful. Beautiful. I love your answers. Hailey, what's your history and inspiration?
I wish I could remember the titles or authors of these books that my mom had, that I was kind of swiping from her room. But they're and I honestly, if you asked me what were the plots, I really couldn't tell you. But what I remember was just this idea of just that this sense of danger to the lovers in these stories. Like they're all from women's point of views, and these men were either had secrets. Like I wouldn't say they were Bluebeard situations necessarily, but they were definitely there was a sense of having to tiptoe, and yeah, that's not okay, but it's also was just it had this sensuality to it, and it had this thrill in reading it. And I wish I could remember what any of those books were called or about or who they were written by. And that feels terrible as an author to say.
No, that's where a lot of people get their early inspiration. I mean, there's some very smart women podcasters that I listen to, and they will them and all their guests talk about how at 11 years old, they were reading mom and grandma's, books, and started the whole thing.
And then on the outside books, I'm always going back to Hellraiser.
Oh, nice.
And I say outside books, even though it's based on books. I only read the book a couple years ago, finally, but I saw the movie much too young, but it had such an impact on me as just even beyond the actual sexual stuff that's going. It feels like everything's alive and warm. Even the house has a skin to it, and it just feels that was just immensely influential on me in ways that I wouldn't completely untangle for many years.
Yeah. I think you and I were our episode's going to post next week, and where you and I were talking about Tim Curry in
oh god, oh my god, Legend. Yeah, and Legend. So we went on a whole tangent about Lord Darkness, and
we talked about all the hotties from our childhood movies.
Yeah, well, I mean that's one of those things where it's just you see that, and it's just well, how can you not be crazy about the monster when you see him step out of that mirror being 8 foot tall with those horns and the black cloak just flapping behind, and it's just oh my god.
I don't know if you know Sarah Hawley, but when I had Sarah Hawley the first time on my show, we were talking about how much Fantasia affected us too, because you have the demon coming out with his wings and everything, and we're our little childhood hearts were pumping for that. Hi Ren, I'm sure I frightened you. Would you like to talk about your early inspirations?
Well, first of all, plus one for that Hellraiser thing is same. And comic was a huge part of my life growing up, and there are so many aspects, so many comic book titles that you wouldn't have thought would really hit hard on that horror romance category, but it really does once you start reading it. It's the normal comic stuff that you would assume yes, Hellraiser, Preacher, Constantine. Yes. Constantine especially was a huge influence on me. He's my favorite DC character of all time, and even something not as obvious like Swamp Thing specifically.
Oh my god! There's a scene in Saga. I'm sorry to cut in, but the scene in Saga of the Swamp Thing when Alicia eats the fruit from his body, and you have that whole trippy drug sex kind of scene. Oh my god!
Those were the comics that a teenager should not be reading, but I read them all the same. So it formed an integral part of how I viewed and how I started learning how to relate more with monsters, especially with Swamp Thing, because Swamp Thing originally started as just some bioorganic thing that rose from the swamp one day and achieved some level of sentience. But the reboot or the remake that I specifically liked was when it actually merged with a man, with the consciousness of a man. So it actually retained life experiences of what it is to be human, even though he looked nothing human, and he's able to engage in a relationship with, like, he has a girlfriend, Abigail Arcane, and that sort
Sorry,
of
I said Alicia. I meant Abigail.
that was such a shift in my worldview of how to treat monsters, that I really consider that one of the integral parts of me slowly starting to understand why I like monsters so much.
Yeah.
And I love gothic as well. Like, my favorite, even if it's not romance coded, there is some element of, like, eroticism, or not exactly eroticism, more, there's a romantic element always when it comes to gothic fiction, regardless of whether it's romance or not. And one of my favorite gothic books isn't even romance. It's Gormenghast, which is basically this very weird castle in the middle of nowhere, and it talks about its very weird inhabitants and how they interact with each other, which includes, like, murder and everything else. But it's so wonderfully written that the castle itself is a character on its own, and that's the kind of gothic horror that hits me the best.
Well, Gothic evokes, like what you were saying earlier, Hailey. I mean, it's that thing where these are visceral responses to things. Your heart is racing, whether it's the fear, whether it's feeling cold, whether it's, all of your senses are hyper alert. That makes absolute sense. Yeah. I don't know what that is, but okay. Are we haunted?
Oh, I wonder if that's my cat pawing at the closet door.
Oh, Desiree.
That's opening now, so
Now she's satisfied. She opened it.
Well, that's cute too.
That was
not
one.
haunted,
You know
but
what?
we
No,
have
it was
a cat.
no. So I lied. Not my cat. I don't have cats. This live is haunted.
Oh my gosh, Shimaira, what's your early inspiration?
oh, I'm also right there with you with Hellraiser, but indeed also just darkness, and that. Yeah, I remember I had one particular nightmare even featuring him that stuck with me for quite some time. But also movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, big inspiration. When it comes to art, I was very much into the works of Louis Royo.
Oh yeah,
That's
Mhm.
just perfection. Also with the monstrous, because he did it really well. The monstrous, and then with feminine beauty. Just the combination of it was just, I was so into it. Still am. But also movies like Queen of the Damned.
Yeah,
I ended up having a copy just on my MP4 player, just watching the movie almost back to back at some point, because I loved it so much.
Were you okay with Stuart Townsend? Because I totally was, and I don't know if I'm in the minority, but I feel like I was fine watching him slink around in his leather pants. So I was fine with this. He wasn't blonde, but I mean, it's fine.
Well, I'm also very much face blind, so I was also like, just one act to the next, just doesn't do anything.
And Aaliyah was like amazing in that movie. Like Aaliyah just, I mean, she wasn't on the screen very long, but that had a big impact, I think, on a lot of writers, her presence. So, what?
Which character? Because I'm very bad with actor names, but which character is that then?
Aaliyah, she was the queen.
Oh, she was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Just stunning.
Absolutely. Desiree, what were your early influences reading?
So it's kind of funny that Lynn said that Beauty and the Beast, the gritty version, was an influence. Well, I'm a child of the 90s, so the Disney version was an influence for me. I think as a kid, I always loved spooky things. And yeah, Beauty and the Beast was one. I also really liked like all the Halloween movies, like The Addams Family, Casper. Each of those have like little threads of romance in it. In The Addams Family, it's king and queen, Morticia and Gomez Adams.
Those are end goals. Yeah.
Yep.
End goals for sure. Let's see what else. I really liked the Sleepy Hollow movie that Tim Burton did. I also really enjoyed The Mummy. So honestly, I think all of my influences were from the 90s.
I have another one. Who here? Beetlejuice.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Yep.
I love how the Mummy actually continues to basically motivate the entire Romance Landia.
It does. It does.
Oh my god.
But as an adult, I would say, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to say it hits every preference. If you're male and straight, you got that. You're female and straight, you got that. You're queer, you got that.
Yeah. It's all our needs.
The whole cast, beautiful, gorgeous.
What were you gonna say?
Oh, as an adult, I would say The Shape of Water. That really put me on the path to loving monster romance.
I'm still amazed how that made it so mainstream. It made monster loving mainstream.
Right?
Yeah.
Desiree and I talked about that on an early episode of the show, because when I formed my show, it was really wanting to be like a bridge between these genres. And like we had to talk about that movie. And I did ask actually Daniel Strauss about it whenever he came on the show, because I said, I know you've got whale fallout, but we need some Shape of Water time.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear y'all say that. And then the response on your faces, I saw Hailey grab your.
I cried for that movie. Yeah. It's just.
Isn't it beautiful? It's so beautiful.
Was.
Well, so let's talk about. I know, Lynn, I was really interested in you talking about art being an influence, because I was an art history major, and so I actually had a lot of these conversations as a student in art history class, where a lot of the things that we see were very sensual and horrific. I mean, going back even to like Renaissance and all, I mean, they love genre blending there. And so it's very interesting to me to see, like, as humans, we still tap into the same side of that blade, like, you know, like both sides of that blade. And so I'm kind of interested to see, going back to something that we were saying and all of this, and it made me think of like Andres Serrano, for example, used to just kind of bore me because I felt like he was trying too hard. And I feel like sometimes, kind of going back to our earlier part of our conversation, there are people that try too hard to just use it to shock. And I'd like to have y'all's point of view on this, because I'm not clutching pearls. I'm just like, oh, it's so empty. Like, I think it's boring when people use it to shock, because there's like more shocking things in the world than sex, and no matter what you do with it. So, I mean, I don't know. I'd love to have y'all's take on it, because I think, unfortunately, people don't know what to do sometimes. But I mean, I think there's very smart people doing very good work, and y'all are on the panel, and there's more besides. But I do find that there are times where people like, yeah, let's fuck a tumor, and think that's edgy, and I'm like, oh gosh, you know, let's grow up a little bit, guys. It doesn't bother me so much as bore me. And so I'm just kind of curious about what you all think of this trend of just trying to use it for shock value. Who wants to start there, and then we can work around? Okay, Hailey.
The reason I want to start is because we're in this kind of cultural circumstance where I feel like even having a sex scene or spice in there at all shocks some people, and it immediately tanks how they're feeling about it. And it's just like, I don't like that very much, but that is what it is. But so you don't have to if you're wanting to shock people, you don't have to tiptoe very far to do it. So, and what is shocking to one person isn't going to be another, or it'll bore some people, etc. So I think what's most important, though, and kind of paraphrasing something David Lynch said, was that the important thing is to be honest.
Yes.
Is to approach a scene with honesty. Like to just pull on one of my books, Queen of Teeth has a 3-way sex scene between 2 women and a vagina monster. And I didn't write that because like, oh, this is really gonna mess with some heads. I wrote it because it was something I wanted to read and something I wanted to experience writing and indulge in. I like people there are people who are like, this book was so scary, which like again, that's as subjective as what's sexy, or like, or this scene, this was gross. I don't find it gross. I thought it was like I thought it was beautiful and sensual, and that was why I did it. And I think that if you approach those scenes with that in mind, like this is what arouses me, or this is what makes me feel accepted, or whatever. If you do that, then I feel like that's not going to be doing it for shock value. It's not going to be this empty thing. It's going to be a whole thing that you put your heart into. And I know that's scary for some people because then it makes you vulnerable. But that's what if you're not going to be vulnerable, what are we even doing with art?
I think what you're saying is really important though, because the thing is that when you are honest and when you do care about the work, and this is why I was very protective, as was Romancelandia, about whenever Chuck Tingle came out, because he takes his work seriously.
Yeah.
And it shines in the work. It comes through in the work, everything that you're saying, and so I think that when that's not there, as I think Desiree or somebody else said it earlier, like it feels mechanical and it doesn't feel, it feels disingenuous. But whereas when you care about it, you see it.
Yeah.
It's a different result. I don't know. What do y'all think? Maybe I'm just not right about that.
I have thoughts. I really, really like the point of coming from a place of like what your intentions are coming into it. Like, are you handling sensitive material responsibly? Are you trying to leave a message with readers, or are you trying to traumatize them?
Yeah.
Like what are you doing this? I guess I don't want to say selfishly, because we all write to satisfy ourselves, to express ourselves. But I guess my point is, like, how much are you considering what the reader is going to get out of it?
Yeah. I think what's really important to note too is that Romancelandia has definitely had this conversation. I don't really know that I've seen it so much in the horror spaces. Maybe y'all can speak to this, and more than me. But one of the conversations that's happened in Romancelandia, which I think is a very important conversation, is that when they are blending genre like this, and especially when it comes to things like scarred heroes or monster horror, are we othering someone and making it like what is it called? Not like a fetish, but like fetishizing it. And it causes harm. Like we want to make sure to avoid that, so that sometimes when I think people are coming at it from shock value, they may be doing more than shocking someone. They may be harming someone. And that's an important conversation. Yes.
I remember reading a story or a novel actually years and years ago. I don't remember the name of it. But what I do remember is there were 2 protagonists. One was an older man whose face was burned so badly in a fire that he was considered to be monstrous in appearance, and he wore a mask. And he developed a friendship with a younger woman who became his lover and who asked him to remove his mask before they actually consummated their relationship. And it was very profound and very moving, because he was not seen anymore as a monster. He was not othered. He was the full human that he had been before the fire and after the fire. And the relationship between the 2 of them was very powerful and very strong. And and I think it was gratifying because he was accepted by this younger person, by this woman, and she was accepted by him. There was an agency, a power.
Oh, yeah.
Each of them held. And I think that was really, really important. This novel was written by a woman. I think that it was written by a woman was very important to the character development and to how the characters related to each other.
I think that, absolutely true. And that's one of the reasons why in romance there is like a character trope of a scarred hero, or even with monster romance, it can be considered, a trope for this. Like, Desiree, you have Given to the Ghoul, where what she's saying kind of just is a similar thing that happened with your story.
Yeah. It was. So the ghoul was a shapeshifter, so could present as human, but had a monstrous face. Like, true face was a monster's face. And with the female lead, often wanted to hide that monster face, did not know how she would react to it. So it was a way to explore vulnerability.
Yes.
And the whole goal of that relationship was to make him feel comfortable with his true self around her. It was something that she encouraged and bringing out in him, is like, no, you don't have to hide yourself. I see you. I love you just as you are.
Shimaira, you had something that you wanted to say.
Basically what I wanted to say was that what I think is most important is also when you write often from a point of view of a certain character. And if you're doing it well, you will actually be able to, when the character is shocked, the reader is supposed to have to share the same feelings.
Yeah.
So the moment when a character gets shocked by something, or when they actually go over that shock, or they actually develop more like romantic feelings or lust feelings, if you can get it on the page, then you already tend to go away from the othering.
Yeah. Rin, did you have something that you wanted to say about this?
I just wanted to say, like, with regards to the shock factor, like, it has a place in horror, but it doesn't necessarily have that specific place in romance. And I think that that's how horror and romance is similar in a lot of ways, because there are going to be, for example, horror movies that is just there for the shock factor.
Yeah.
Like that new clown movie that I keep forgetting.
Terrifier.
Terrifier, yes. That's shock factor. Chainsaw Massacre is a shock factor to a certain extent. Saw is also just there for the shock factor. And those are the kinds of movies that don't actually frighten me, because I'm not the person that those movies are made for. But the horror movies that frighten me, it's The Ring, it's The Grudge, it's Tale of Two Sisters. It's a lot of those Asian psychological horrors that and it shocked me, not necessarily because they're barging in through the door with chainsaws revving up. They shock me as also as an Asian person, because a lot of those Asian psychological horrors really deal with family, with like the issues that come with family, and issues that a lot of Asian families actually deal with. And I mean, I consider Parasite a horror movie. Like, that is peak Asian issue.
Yeah.
And that I feel like when it comes to romance, that's also that similar thing that separates romance from erotica, and it's also the same thing that separates shock factor horror movies from the more psychological inclined horror movies. And I think that is intimacy. With horror movies, with the shock factor, there's no intimacy involved. You don't know who that person is coming after you, attacking you. They're just gonna randomly attack everybody that comes within their range.
Yeah.
But with psychological horror, it feels more intimate, because why that particular ghost or that particular antagonist is stalking you or attacking you. And it has a lot to do with you, and it has a lot to do with how your connection with them. And it's the same thing with erotica, and the same thing with romance. Romance requires intimacy.
Yeah.
Erotica is what they're doing, but romance is why they're doing it.
Yes, that's perfect. And that also speaks to what you were talking about with Gothic. I mean, whether or not there's an HEA or even a romance in there, if that everything that you're saying, about it being the psychological element is part of Gothic. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even if there's not a romance, it can feel sensual, because when you're dealing with all of the internal monologues, internal feelings, like everything's heightened. Yeah, absolutely. Lynn, you were going to indulge me because I'm 51 years old, and you were going to indulge me a little bit in talking about women of a certain age or characters of a certain age and representation as sensual or sexual in horror or in fiction. And I did a Crone-lit episode last year that was one of my most popular episodes of the year. And people from all kinds of genres were tuning into it because, and we did talk about books that were across genre. So that helped. But it's something that I think people weren't really tapping into. And I'm not trying to say like Gen X just came in and decided Crones were cool because we're Crones, but it is kind of experiencing this interesting as conversations about our bodies and pleasure and everything else has become normal. It's okay to talk about these things. We're now talking about menopause like out loud, like we didn't used to do that. We're seeing fiction, and sometimes this is manifesting in cross genre with women, especially being witches, and so it's like it crosses genre between romance and horror, often in a witch space, because what happens is that we wind up finding our power as we enter menopause, for example, and really reclaiming power we didn't have, going back to agency, which is a very, agency is very important to witch stories. And Paulette Kennedy had The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, which dealt with like telekinesis, which is a different kind of power than like a witch power. So that's another form that you'll see sometimes. And so I just think it's really interesting that there's all of this, there's a movement happening, if you will. And I think we're seeing it in fantasy too, where you're seeing more women of a certain age be featured in ways that are interesting and beautiful and sensual. I'd love for you to be able to speak to that. Can you hear me? So somebody said I was breaking up.
Yeah,
it's better now.
You're breaking up.
Can y'all hear me?
That's better.
No.
Hear anything I said?
Only the last sentence for me was a little too broken up. But
okay, so if I'm normal now, I'll try to do a smaller thing. Basically, fiction with women of a certain age being featured because we're finding power as we enter menopause or a certain age, like our children have left the nest, et cetera, et cetera. And it's happening in romance, fantasy, horror, across genre. And I'd love for you to be able to speak to our representation as sexual, sensual, powerful beings in fiction when we haven't really been represented so much before. Did I break up again?
I feel like when you lean close to the computer, you're clearer.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good right there.
Please don't make me say it a third time.
Agency when aging, basically.
Bing, bang, boom. Do y'all understand where I'm going with this question?
Yeah.
Aging, agency, horror, romance, sexual. Hit it. Old people being sexy too, like Gen X going, yes, it's our time.
Totally. Well, when you look at a lot of traditional societies, women were not considered powerful until they were crones, until they were older. And I think, unfortunately, in our society, that's not the case. Instead of accruing power, we're divested of it. And I think now that a lot of older women are having agency, are writing about our lives, about our histories, about our presents, our futures. I think that is a slight change, but I don't know how deep or influential a change it is. I think as succeeding generations of women begin to write about their power and write in their power, this will have a change in literature. But I want to say also that the idea of the witch, the crone, has been with me all my life. I was also raised on the old Baba Yaga tales and the old tales about witches and the power of witches. And in fact, just this afternoon, I was watching a reel about a woman in Ireland called Bridget O'Cleary, who became very ill, and this was in the 1920s. Her husband wanted to rid her body of demons, and so he and other villagers tortured Bridget O'Cleary and gave her poisonous concoctions to drink and ultimately burned her alive. And I think that this also, this horror attests to the power of women, even women who are sick, who are unwell, who are marginalized. So, but when I'm writing, I write from the point of view of women of various ages. In my novella, the protagonist is 21 years old because I can go right back there to that time in my life and remember those feelings and experience those feelings again. I'm also currently working on another novella with a crone who is of indeterminate age, who is essentially a witch who uses mushrooms to poison men who are hunting water for a private water company. So the power of women, when you're writing from this particular age, seems to be much stronger and much deeper than when I was younger, even though I wasn't writing that much when I was young. So yeah, I think I'm rambling a bit here, but I think the power of old age is very important in writing.
I think it's interesting that you brought up Bridget Cleary, because I have the book, The Burning of Bridget Cleary. It's a biography about her.
Oh my goodness.
They
Wow.
thought she was a fairy changeling. And
Yes.
they burned her because she started claiming her sensuality a little bit. She wasn't even being promiscuous, but she was maybe wearing stockings that they thought were too risque, or, allowing herself to be pretty and certain things like this. And so her husband just became convinced that she must be a fairy changeling. And I mean, they burned her at the stake. So that book, and if anybody's interested, is The Burning of Bridget Cleary.
And in what year was this?
The early 20th century.
Yeah. Around 100 years ago, I think.
So
Big
yeah.
yikes.
Too recent.
The Lore podcast, I think, did an episode on that as well. What was I gonna? I thought somebody had something to say here, but so I know, kind of speaking on the subject a little bit, I know y'all have seen these books where, even if you haven't reached the certain age, women in their 30s, for example, are starting to write a little bit more about aging. You're seeing books that deal with the beauty industry and horror, and tapping into this combination of sex and sex appeal and being sensual and maintaining that youth. But now it's horror because there's all this pressure. So there's, like Youth Juice and Rouge, and Rachel's book, So Thirsty, Rachel Harrison's, deals with someone who was like grappling with aging, and now they're going to forever be in their 30s. And so I'm just curious about y'all's thoughts on it, even if you haven't reached my ripe old age. What are your thoughts on it? Are your characters getting older as you're writing, for example? Things like this. What is on all of this? Yes.
I have noticed that I started writing my dark fantasy novel when I was like 15, 16. It took me 10 years to complete the first draft at 140K, left it for a few years, looked back, cringed really hard, started a rewrite. And one of the things I did was just age up the characters because, I'm no longer writing a 16-year-old because I'm not 16 anymore. But also the entire fact that a demon lover of several centuries old, with a 16, 17-year-old. Nah, no, not digging that anymore. Give me some more mature characters here.
Yeah.
So that's a big change. But yeah, I'm also just noticing that I just doesn't appeal to me anymore to write to young characters. So yeah, definitely seeing a change there.
Rin, I think you write YA as well as adult, right? So I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Yeah, I can offer like the major difference between writing for teenagers and writing for adults. And when it comes to writing for teenagers, there's a little bit more emphasis on teenage independence and teenage like sovereignty, and it's mainly about teenagers just being, being teenagers. Like, I know everything. I know, like, I am in charge of my own life. I feel like I know things that I can make decisions at better than other adults in my life, and on occasion those backfire. And it's really important to also portray that in books when you're writing for teenagers, that sometimes you're not always, the smartest person in the planet, much less the smartest person in your own life, and that some decisions that you make, you have to live through the consequences. And sometimes that's the whole plot of the book, living through the consequences of your actions. But when I started writing for adults, it kind of shifts, actually. It's that realization that you don't know anything, you don't know everything, and there's that shift from thinking you know what you should be doing at your age to, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. What am I gonna do? And that sort of crossroads when you're, I guess, in your 20s and even in your 30s, where you start thinking really seriously, what am I to do with my own life? I the plan, the plan that I wrote in my teens is not working out within those few years of becoming an adult. So now that is scrapped, what am I gonna do? What purpose do I have in life? And that's the sort of, I think, in for a lot of people in their 20s and 30s, that's the struggle, especially nowadays, when things feel like it's constantly shifting, and you don't find a steady anchor for yourself, much less feel like there's a place for you in the world, and you start questioning things a little more closely, and trying, just basically just trying your best, figuring out what you want to do. I like tapping into that sort of confusion and that sort of uncertainty. So, and sometimes a lot of the plot also comes with dealing with it. Like, you don't necessarily know, like, in some of my books, you don't necessarily reach a conclusion about what you want to do in life, but at the very least, uh they're the my characters try to find some satisfaction in where they are at that point in their lives as well.
That's so important, especially because actually a lot of adults read young adult and are probably still grappling with these questions. Desiree and Hailey, do y'all have anything to add about like aging and as you write and how you're incorporating sex or romance or sensuality?
I mean, I understand what Lynn is saying, because like I still write younger characters sometimes, even though all of my books are adult books, but I still write younger characters sometimes because you can just bounce back to that. And I remember like as a teenager just feeling like kind of crushed constantly, and like that things were just, everything was very much too much, and that not realizing until later that feeling doesn't really go away. It kind of life itself is just constantly overwhelming one way or another, but it's different. Like I noticed that is the way where it just feels like kind of almost a hopelessness sometimes, but it's like, okay, if I can just get a little older, then I'll be out of that. And then as I got into writing more adult characters, kind of just this sense of like, just being lost, not sure, like what Rin was talking about, just kind of just not sure what the direction is supposed to be in life, that maybe there was going to be more clarity that didn't come. But what was funny to me is what Shimaira was saying about spending time writing a dark fantasy book, because I had the same thing where I was writing a dark fantasy book when I was a teenager, and I had written the characters at first to be like early 20s. And by the time I got around to when it like came out a couple years ago, I had aged one of them up into being 40. One of them was 50, and it was just like, that's older than me. But still, I was just like, that's what felt right for the things that they were going to be going through and the places they were going to be in their lives, where it's just like, and I think that was always the case, but back when I was 16, I was like, yeah, 21.
That seems far enough.
Right. 21 as an adult. That's enough to have like the weight of the world on your shoulders. Sure.
I love that there's this understanding amongst y'all too. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Desiree, how about you?
I don't know. I feel like most days I'm like, I need an adult help. But I am an adult. I'm supposed to have answers now. And like 16-year-old me would be looking at like me now and just being like, all right, what are we doing? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I kind of hoped that there would be more clarity with time, but the world is ever changing. And I feel like I don't have any more answers than I did when I was at 16. I mean, maybe to some degree I have some answers.
With your characters in your story, how is any of this manifesting? Like
I would say my character, I would say my characters are aging with me, but I am starting to tend towards writing older characters. So in Untethering Dark, the female main character is 35, but her adoptive mother, Harkta, who is a folkloric figure in Germany, she's like 1,500 years old. Mm-hmm. And I find writing older characters allows me to pretend like I have answers, like I know what I'm doing, because they have the power, they have the knowledge, and they're passing their wisdom.
Yeah. I also love whenever, like, I think people are also recognizing now that, like, you can be 51 and you don't look like the woman in The Shining in the bathroom. Like, people are understanding now, like, what aging looks like, and that it's not what they expect. And so it's really interesting, I think, to see them portray us sensually or sexually as we age now. And I'm just loving the evolution. So,
but I think what you were saying about horror against like the beauty industry and such, like looking at it that way is really important, though, because it is, we are constantly bombarded with this stuff that says you're not enough, you're not pretty enough, you don't have enough sexiness, this, that, and the other thing. I don't know who's read Natural Beauty by Ling Huang, but that like directly confronts the beauty industry as this horrible machine that literally takes women in and grinds them up to be used for advertising and selling and such.
That, what was the name of that one?
Natural Beauty.
Unnatural, like UN?
No, natural.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just want to make sure I hear it right. So
yeah.
I want to read that now. Well, we have a few more minutes. I would love for y'all to tell us what you have next. Why don't we start with Lynn and work our way back up? What are you working on? What do you have next? Did I lose Lynn? Why do I always do this?
She's back.
Okay.
She'll come back.
Okay, well, let's start. Okay, go ahead, Hailey.
So my next book is, it's going to be backwards here, but A Game in Yellow is coming out August 12th. And it's an erotic, cosmic horror, queer horror book about a couple who they are trying to spice up their love life, and they find a book. They find a woman who has a book that if you read too much of this book, you'll go mad. But if you read just a little and pull back, it can give you survivor's euphoria, which can heighten their sex life again. But it's kind of becomes a dance of like too much and too little. and the danger that's there of like what's on the other side of these pages. What world are they getting into by trying to have a sexier time? Yeah, so
Y'all, your fans are all starting to chime in here on the side. Go ahead and hold it up because it wasn't backwards.
Oh, it wasn't? Oh,
Nuh-uh.
it looks backwards to me. So yeah, Game in
That's
Yellow
fine.
is coming out from Saga August 12th.
Hey, Rin, Lynn is still frozen. So Rin, why don't you let us know what you're working on, what you have coming out?
Well, my most recent, I have some other books that are under contract right now, so I can't really say much until they make the official announcement. But for now, my last book that came out is Silver Under Nightfall and its sequel, Court of Wonders. So it's that book. This is the
Oh.
UK version. Yes.
Okay.
It's the UK version. There's a US version as well. So that's a bit more colorful, red and blue. So if you have a penchant for red and blue instead, I am sure it's in most bookstores at the moment. It is a duology about a vampire hunter who, well, I like to describe it when I talk about that book, is a vampire couple finds a vampire hunter in the trash and takes him in, and things go from there. So it if you're into like vampires, vampire hunting, lots of fight scenes, and of course the romance, that please do give it a try.
That sounds exciting. Shimaira, what do you have?
Well, I'm currently working on. I hope it shows a little.
Oh,
Does it?
yeah.
Yeah, it shows. So basically, this is basically just a full horror novel. Like, I don't intend for there to be any spice in this, but it does have characters that are in my current published book. So that would be. I have it here. So basically, the character that's on this book and also on the back, they are also going to be in this one, but they're not. At least in the first half, they're not even in the story yet. They come in later, and the MC actually does have some spice with the cover girl, but at the current version, it's closed doors. No clue if that's going to change yet. It all depends on what the story basically wants or needs. But the story itself is basically just about this undercover cop basically fucks up royally, gets kidnapped, and kept as a torture pet. And at some point, she tries to get out, and the entire story is basically about how far are you willing to go for your own freedom. And in this case, are you willing to actually sacrifice your whole humanity for it? So.
Thank you. I think while we've got Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and let you go so that we make sure to get it in. What do you have working? What's coming out next? What are you working on?
What's coming out is, if you can see it, Origins of Desire in Orchid Fens.
Ooh,
It's
beautiful cover.
Isn't it gorgeous? Yeah,
That's
they actually
beautiful.
Stelliform Press, lovely Stelliform Press is doing this. They surprised me with the cover, and it actually inspired me to rewrite a whole section of the novella, which was really a wonderful experience. But it's got river spirits. It has a lover who may or may not be human. It's got orchid fens and lush orchids to roll around in and indulge yourself. It's got betrayal. It's got murder. It's got attempted murder. It's got gossip. It's got old wives' stories. It's the story of a young Romany woman in Northern Ontario who allies with river spirits to stop a gold mine from destroying an orchid fen.
I love the combination of like eco with, you know what I mean? I love that eco element.
It's all in there.
Yeah. I know you do too, Desiree, because that's your thing.
Yeah. That's actually what I'm working on next. The novella that I'm hoping to release sometime this spring. It takes place in a bog, and so a man is trying to sabotage this commercial real estate project that's
Wow.
intending to drain the bog that he loves, and he ends up getting mired in the very muck he's trying to save, and is rescued by a mysterious woman, and murder and mayhem ensue.
As you
It's
do.
it's a mashup of two classic horror stories.
And congratulations again on being the very first monster romance from Harlequin. Do you have the cover for that handy? Untethering Dark comes out in February.
No, I don't.
It's okay. It's
Sorry.
okay.
It's digital only. You know what? Maybe I can pull it up on my phone. I don't know if it'll show up backwards, but we'll give it a try.
Well, that's a very big deal. You're breaking them in.
It's showing up. It's not mirrored.
There we go.
There it is.
Very, very cool. Very excited for that. So, that's a big deal. So congratulations. And all of your stories sound so interesting. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, TBRCon, for inviting us to participate in this very interesting topic on romance, sex, and sensuality and horror. And I just appreciate y'all were so engaging. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agatha.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great fun.